So this is how to look at a download for T-Slim with Control IQ using Gluco. First of all, you need to search for the person, and then once you've got this up, you need to ideally create a PDF report, because jumping between them can be quite difficult and you don't need them all. So the easiest way is you can create your own template. Then you go to create PDF, choose the ones that you want. Ideally you want the summary, but you don't want the blood glucose information. You want the week view, and you want the devices. Pretty much everything you need should be within here. You may have your own favorites, but this will give you everything that you need. And importantly, to save yourself time next time, if you save this as a preference, we'll call it AID, and this is 2 weeks, because you can see here, this is 2 weeks. You can do it at a week, a month, or 90 days, but generally we're making changes over the last 2 weeks. So once you've saved that, click OK, and that will be saved in your, next time you can just click on it. And then we are going to create our PDF. So obviously it then creates a PDF and we can have a look at it. Once the report comes up, you've got your summary page. So what we need to use here is use a calculator to give us some support. So we know that this person is on 58.3 units of insulin. So on our tool, total insulin, you can just put 58.3. And I know this person weighs 70 kilos. So obviously you need to get their weight. Once you've got that there, you need to think about how much percentage you want their basal rate to be, so you can use their download as a bit of a guide. So you can see here that generally 37% is the basal insulin, so you can use that. It's going to be anywhere between 30 and 50. It's to give you an idea of either manual settings or what you might consider the basal rate. So about 40% is right. The younger children who are more sensitive to insulin will probably be closer to 30%. The older children who are less active and less sensitive to insulin will be closer to 50%. So once you've got that in there, you need to put what system that are on, and you can put Control IQ. And that essentially tells you this person is on sort of a medium to low sensitivity to insulin. So the suggestions here may be somewhere close to correct. And the beauty of this is it kind of gives you an idea of how to approach a consultation and what you can change on the system, which will change how the algorithm works and what needs updating in the background. So simply what you do need to update in the background is you need to update their weight and total daily dose, which you have here, weight and total daily dose, and just go in and change their max basal rates, max boluses and low reservoirs to make sure that the system has capacity to run at its strongest. When we come to have a look at the download in a second, you'll see there's several things that you can change that will change how aggressive or less aggressive the system will be. You can change the carb ratios, and there's some suggestions here of what the carb ratio might be at breakfast or the rest of the day based off general sensitivity rules. So if someone's already got 70-75% time in range and things going fine, you're not even going to consider these, it's likely. However, if someone's got less than 60% time in range, it may be that they need some optimization of their carb ratios. These are some suggestions based off general rules, but obviously use your clinical judgment. These are just here based off the average person. Who you're seeing is not necessarily the average person. This throws out what roughly the basal rates would be at about 40% of total daily dose. And for an T-Slim, this is important because although the basal may be being delivered at 40%, it may be because the system's working quite hard, for example, so that the basal rates may actually be down at something like 0.5. And when we have a look on the download, you can see that the system's pushing loads of extra basal in. It may be that you do require to update some of the basal rates, especially if they haven't been updated for some time. And I guess the most important thing for how Control IQ works is the sensitivity factor. The lower you make this number, the more aggressive the system will be at putting extra insulin in. The higher this number, the less aggressive it will be. So when we look at the download, when someone is high and the system is not really kicking in with extra insulin, that's the setting we can tweak to make it more or less aggressive. Again, if someone's got 70-75% time in range, you may not need to tweak that. But if it's quite low and it looks like the system's not working very strong, then it could be that the sensitivity factors need adjusting. So again, it just allows you to know which system you're working and what changes what. So your assessment method should be, first of all, check that they're using the Control IQ for more than 90% of the time. Then check the time below range, make sure it's no more than 4%. If it is, then we need to focus on preventing hypos and the issues there. And then look at time in range, trying to get as close to 70% as possible. And what we need to consider is, yes, there are settings changes, but there's a lot more things we need to think about in terms of behavioural stuff. So how are they managing the highs? How are they managing the lows? What are they doing with their set changes? And what are the standard, and are they following the standard advice for eating? So each system's got a survive and thrive sheet, but they're all very similar. First of all, are they suspending and then restarting the pump when they're taking showers or baths so that the insulin is actually going into the person? When they're going low, are they treating with the adequate amount of hypotreatment, not too much, depending on glucose value and trend arrow? If they've been above 14 for more than 90 minutes, are they changing their cannula in the set at that time, not waiting until their ketones are above 0.6? Because using these systems properly, they shouldn't be experiencing glucose levels above 14 for more than 90 minutes. Are they following effective infusion set and management changes every 2 to 3 days? And rotating the sites, etc. And are they making sure that the CGM is obviously being used for most of the time, and that if the glucose values are different to the blood glucose by more than 20%, they're calibrating. If the insulin is going in effectively and the continuous glucose monitor is accurate, then this system is going to work effectively well. So they're the basics. And then really importantly, when it comes to looking at their control, is the reason they're going high after eating because they're not bolusing before they're eating? Are they doing a bit of activity after eating? And if they're having delayed highs after evening meals where the system's struggling to keep up, is it because it's a high fat meal, in which case they could increase the carbs entered by 25% and do an extended bolus? And then for exercise, do they seem to be going low after certain meals? For example, after school or after lunchtime at school, they could potentially need to be reducing the carbs entered by 25% or putting the exercise mode on, for example. And then obviously they can use activities lower highs and extra bits and pieces, but essentially, are they following the basics, and are they following the food information properly in terms of bolusing before meals? All things important to check as we go through the download. But just to reiterate how we're going to approach this download is we're going to look at, first of all, are they using the system over 90%? What's the lows? What's the highs? Are we following this advice? And then think about making some changes, thinking about using these values to support us if the timing range is certainly not above 60%. So based on our download, you've got the information across the top, which tells you this person is not experiencing too many lows, only 2%, and certainly none of the very low, so hypos are not really an issue. Less than 60% timing range, which definitely could be optimized, getting up towards 70%. If these systems are set correctly, we should be getting 70% as long as the person is following effective daily management strategies. And then obviously the higher side is a little bit too high. We need to move some of these higher levels back to the in range. The CGM across the middle gives us an idea that obviously Control IQ is doing its job overnight. Breakfast doesn't seem to be a problem. Where the problem seems to kick off is after lunchtime. There's something going on at lunchtime where the glucose values are generally going quite high and struggling to, and not coming back down. And again here, going high after the evening meal. So straight away, people are probably thinking it's the carb ratio for lunch and evening meal. But what we need to check is insulin being given at that time? Is it because insulin's given at the wrong time? And also maybe some of the sensitivity factors might need making more aggressive, because the glucose levels certainly shouldn't be going this high. You can have a look down here that this person's putting 240 grams of carbs in with roughly 3 to 4 entries a day, which suggests that they are bolusing frequently, although we can check that as we go. So as we work down, we've obviously got our total daily dose and our breakdown of basal and bolus. But what we're really focusing on is there's not too much of an issue with low levels. We're focusing on what's going on after lunch, what's going on after the evening meal. And we can get an idea of how can we either suggest some behavioral changes or some insulin adjustment changes to support the algorithm to get closer to 70% timing range in this instance. Now what we have now is a week view, and this is sort of the latest week up at the top. And what we can, if I walk you through an individual line and then we'll go. So we'll use this one here. We've got glucose values across the top. We've got the continuous glucose monitoring trace, and we've got where glucose values have been entered into the bolus calculator. And then you can see, obviously, in the green is in target, red is low, orange is high. So on this day, high before going in, Control IQ kicks in, brings them to target. Then go after breakfast, after lunch, and then after the evening meal, for example. Then you've got where carbs have been entered. So you know that this person on this day is given some for breakfast, a bit after breakfast, some for lunch, a bit after lunch, and then some for the evening meal. So there seems to be adequate boluses in. And then on the bottom, we can see there where this is a correction bolus for the 2.7 units for the high. And then you can see carbs and insulin. And then when you can see these little ones with the dark bit about the outside there, where auto corrections have kicked in, where the glucose level is obviously above target, and some auto corrections here as well. Along the bottom here is the basal insulin delivery. So if it's just a solid line like this purple here, that's just normal basal delivery. The system's not having to work any extra or shut off. When the system is having to work extra, you can see that there's little towers of how much extra insulin is going in. And when it's suspending the insulin, you can see the red blocks. So you're bound to see during the day that the system is putting extra insulin and stopping. That's how it's supposed to work. But if we find there's consistent times where the basal insulin is having to be upped all the time, it might suggest that the background basal rates are inadequate. So there's quite a few things to check as we go along. But the main two things that we're going to focus on is what's happening after lunchtime and what's happening after the evening meal on a consistent basis to see whether we think that anything needs changing. So from these top two, we can kind of see here that the insulin is delivered for a late lunch, and it looks like it's being delivered before, yet the insulin is inadequate and the system's had to kick in with extra insulin and auto correction to bring them back down. Similarly for the evening meal, 80 grams of carbs gone very high, and that's required a couple of auto corrections and a lot of extra basal insulin. So that's suggesting that maybe the insulin for the food is inadequate, and we have a similar picture the next day where it certainly looks inadequate. However, the day prior to that, it actually looked okay. So gone a little bit higher, but it's generally all right on those 2 days. But again, a consistent picture. Insulin, which may have been given after eating here, potentially stayed high. Insulin stayed high. Here, interestingly, you can see this is insulin without food, so there's no carb bolus here, and there's just auto corrections. There's obviously food gone in here and food gone in here with no bolus insulin, so that's the reason why it's gone high on those days. It was fine after lunch on that day, but definitely gone high after the evening meal on that day. And if we take back at the further weeks, do we have a similar pattern? Okay-ish after lunch, gone high after the evening meal, gone high after lunch, high after the evening meal, bit high after lunch, definitely high after the evening meal. So I think we can probably say, looking at this, the evening meal carb ratio is definitely going to need some extra insulin, and you look at all these auto corrections that are going in, possibly at lunchtime as well. And those seem to be the two consistent things that we can think about making a change to support this working. And then also to consider is, you would have thought that these auto corrections here would work much more effectively than someone being high for all this period of time. So is the sensitivity factor also inadequate? I guess what we'd think about doing first is changing the carb ratios to make sure there's adequate insulin for the food, and then we'll see on a secondary basis whether the correction factor needs making more aggressive to keep up with the sort of higher levels potentially. So that's probably where we would start looking at this download, and we'd certainly be having some conversation with regards to days where we've identified where there's eating without insulin, such as this day here, no lunch, no evening meal entered, which is probably the reason why it's gone high. So there's some discussion to be had there. There may also be some discussion around insulin timings. Presumably there's also been some food before the insulin going in. So there's a couple of behavioural things to potentially consider depending on what the person discusses during the consultation. And again, here you've got a couple of episodes of there's something obviously been eaten here and there's no insulin, presumably. There's only 2 boluses on that day. Has that person only eaten twice that day? Maybe, maybe not. We'll get a feel for that. Do the basal rates seem adequate overall? Is there a lot of extra insulin going in overnight? So I mean, here we've got a few examples of where the glucose level is in target and it stayed in target all night here. There's quite a bit of extra basal that's been pushed in, and certainly is on that night there. There's a little bit extra there, there's a few suspensions. Some extra going in there. Few suspensions, but some extra. So maybe, maybe not. There's a bit of a mixed bag. So if we then go and have a look at the settings at the bottom, we've got in our idea we need to potentially strengthen the carb ratio at lunchtime and evening meal, and we maybe need to consider as a secondary approach, once that we've changed that, to see whether the correction factors potentially need making more aggressive. So when you get to a T-Slim, you get down to the settings sheet and they may have different profiles. So you can see here there's a sick day which is currently active, so that's telling you the one they're currently using. You want to check whether they're using that all the time or they're flitting between sick day and then their usual day. So again, it's important to ask that, are they flicking between profiles? Because if they are, you're going to have to adjust both, but maybe it's just that they're using the sick one at the moment. So you can see here there are the basal rates across the day, and then there are carb ratios, and then there are sensitivity factors. So the ones that we're looking at for thinking of the lunchtime and the evening meal for the carb ratios, for example, the lunchtime one is possibly often, if it's been given between 11:30 and 12:30, it's at 1 to 8.7, whereas if it's after 12:50, it's actually more aggressive by quite a bit. So it could be the days where they're bolusing before 1 p.m. that the issues are. And similarly, these ones at 8.7 later on after 4 p.m. seem inadequate. So it looked like those three are the ones that we need to adjust. We can have a conversation. When we look at the sensitivity factors, again, they're much weaker at the second part of the day, which may be part of the reason why the system is also not working as effective. So we're probably looking at these three carb ratios, the one at 1130, 1600 and 1900 hours. And then as a secondary in the future, giving them the advice that if that doesn't seem to work, maybe we need to squeeze these down to say 2.5, 2.2 to make them more aggressive across the day. When we compare that to our settings checker, just to sort of see, it would suggest a correction of about 2.2, so that seems about right there. And then carb ratios for the rest of the day, which is the time we're looking at, should be about 1 to 6, and they're currently at sort of 8.7. So again, you could think about taking that 8.7 to a 6.7, which is similar to the other ones. That might be a place to start. And there's a few behavioural things. So I guess the finish of the consultation, well, the start of the consultation will be you've been through the download, you'll hopefully done that with them, but if you haven't done that with them, you're going to walk through with them and explain that overall we don't have a problem with hypoglycemia. 60% time in range, you certainly need to squeeze that and make that more aggressive, and it's great that they're using Control IQ. Not full time, it needs to be above 90%, but they're certainly entering their insulin, and then there's a suggestion that the insulin at lunch and evening meal are inadequate. You can then have the conversation that we have, walking through the download with them, showing where the issues are, and then the suggestion to make the carb ratios more aggressive, as we just said, and then the potential of making the sensitivity factors more aggressive as we go along. And if we just compare the basal rates as the final piece, the basal rates are generally anywhere between 0.7, varying down to 0.4 and 0.68. If you compare that to where the tool is suggesting, anywhere should be between 0.87 and 1. So there may be some room over time to increase the basal rates to support the system. But you're going to take one step at a time. And the first step is quite clearly going to be adjusting these carb ratios first. A second step would be maybe to make these correction factors stronger in 2 weeks' time, depending on what's going on here. And then maybe at a later date at the clinic, making sure that the basal rates are kept up to date and increased as we go. So that's how to approach a T-Slim download. And as we said, we also need to make sure that we update the weight and the total daily dose in the Control IQ settings, go into max basal rate, max bolus and low reservoir and adjust those. And then depending on the plan, you'll be discussing obviously the key things to make sure that the insulin definitely goes in. It goes in 15 minutes before food to support the activity there. So that will give you an approach on how to look at a T-Slim download. It's not the perfect approach, but it's one that's suggested by the Panther program, and it will help us get the most out of these algorithms by making sure that we're updating the carb ratios, the correction factors, and the basal rates in a timely manner. And again, if this person is switching between the two profiles, then you've got some extra settings adjustments to make as well. So that's just to bear in mind.